Good evening, everybody. I'm glad we're all here together. NOFA farmers and gardeners have been able to create a welcoming community for people like me. I came from the city. I was totally unprepared for rural life and traumatized by random modern violence. My closest friend and husband was killed in a stupid car crash. But people in NOFA turned out to be my tribe. I felt I had other people who had the same disability that I had, seeing everything as interconnected. And the disciplines that divided things didn't really matter. People who lived doing the healing work of planting seeds and growing healthy food in harmony with nature and the earth, and who were willing to share what they knew with other people. So entering this new world as a white woman, I benefited from the privilege of my race, and I also benefited from having been educated in the most elite schools of the United States. I had been to Columbia and Yale. And even though I came from a family who had been refugees generation back, they'd become middle class, and my parents unstintingly encouraged me in every way they could think of. I just was loved, and whatever I did, they thought was great. So I came into the world of farming with the self-confidence that made me able to say, I reject the values of white suburban society. I reject the farming system that's destroying the planet. And I'm going to farm in a different way, using my values of social justice, opposition to war, and favor of the environment, and grow food, and live in a whole different way. And the NOFA community made me feel comfortable doing that. I moved to Wayne County, New York, where I was one of the very few women and organic farmers. And when they formed a farmland protection board, I saw that as an incredible organizing opportunity, and I became the chair of that board because I was the only one who had any ideas of what we could do. And for 20 years, the conventional farmers kept re-electing me because I studied very hard how to translate sustainable agriculture into small-town Republican. Yeah, it translates well. And that was my focus, how to expand the organic world to bring in the traditional, conventional farmers and who are trapped really in the corporate-dominated industrial agriculture system. So for 20 years, I did that, and since the late 70s, I've been a member of NOFA. And as a group, our generation, we've done some really wonderful, important things. But we've also made some terrible mistakes. And there are things that, in our zeal and our passion, we left out. We left out so many people. But as Fred Lee, who I think is becoming my friend now that I'm getting to know him a bit, says, we need to keep looking forward. We need to learn from our mistakes and embrace this new generation and this new time where we have so much more to learn. Change can be painful because you have to recognize the things that you did wrong, the people you hurt. But it can also be really exhilarating because as we step back and let young energies and new leadership come forward, we will be able to go into the new world that we have always dreamed of anyway. So it's my incredible pleasure this evening and my honor to be able to introduce Leah Penniman. And I want to say a few more words about her and her work. Leah has learned from all of our best practices and gone beyond them. She has so much great energy and inspiring innovation in so many of the areas that as a farmer you need to work. that it's hard to know where to begin talking about her and her farm and the whole team at Soulfire Farm. They've created this outstanding hybrid of regenerative organic practices, reducing tillage to a minimum, a center for racial and social justice, humane treatment of poultry. They're one of the few farms in the whole country that could qualify instantly for the regenerative organic certification if they chose to do that. And I've had the good fortune to visit Soulfire Farm twice, the first on a conference tour and the second as part of the Food Justice Certification training audit. So I've had a really good look at this farm. And I looked in, little hidden places while Leah was out talking to people. So I'm a trained inspector. And what struck me first of all is that no one who had the intention of setting up a produce farm would have chosen this land if they had had the financing and resources to purchase high-quality agricultural land. Soulfire Farm is set back from the main road down a long driveway shared with other people. The land is undulating. Much of it's wooded. The soil is rocky and shallow. But this is the land that Leah and Jonah could afford with the support of their community, and it was located reasonably close to the community in the south end of Albany that they wanted so much to serve. Their community has suffered from food apartheid and from the Sheridan Avenue gas plant that has poisoned and sickened the largely low-income African-American neighborhood for over a century, burning coal, oil, and garbage, and now gas. So with truly heroic determination and unrelenting hard work, Leah and her many helpers have built a foot of fertile topsoil. Taking inspiration from peasant farmers in Haiti and Africa, Soulfire Farm has terraced some of their land. They've built a greenhouse. They've built a beautiful home, 2 acres of beds. They've planted an orchard and perennial beds of medicinal and culinary herbs. And Jonah has used his skills as a natural builder and a designer to create really handsome buildings. There's a barn, there's a workshop, there's housing for people who work at Soulfire Farm that beats almost any farm worker housing or farmer housing that you could find anywhere. It's functional, attractive, clean, and safe. And Leah got her training at some of the very best farms in our organic land, some of the most creative and innovative farms. She rose from crew member to manager with the Food Project, which brings together youth from Boston suburbs and inner city Boston, training them to grow food for a CSA and for battered women's shelters. And across race and class, the Food Project creates a space where these kids from very different backgrounds can encounter one another. And they use a technique called straight talk. Leah then worked at Many Hands Organic Farm, the farm of Jack Kittredge and Julie Rawson. Jack is the editor of The Natural Farmer, the NOFA newspaper, and Julie is the executive director of NOFA in Massachusetts. And there have always been some of their many hands, their 4 children, helping out at the farm. And Many Hands is dedicated to building healthy soil by eliminating tillage to increase soil carbon and to increase microbial life, and to social justice. They hire recently incarcerated people and support them through the struggle to get out of prison and back into society. And Leah also worked at Live Power Community Farm in California, where Gloria and Stephen Decatur used biodynamic practices and horse traction and a very high level of community involvement in their community CSA. At Soulfire Farm, Leah took the work of all of her teachers to a higher level. They've turned straight talk into real talk, adding courageous conversations, a trauma-informed method for addressing troubling incidents, and they also recently engaged in food justice certification. They have made the farm one of the most important centers of farm training for Black and Indigenous people of color, and also for white people and organizations, so that we can hone our skills in understanding and dismantling racism and white supremacy in this country. It's also a center for Albany youth who are at risk, who come to the farm as an alternative to incarceration. It's so much going on, and it's all done really well. And then there's her book, Farming While Black. I made this sort of innocent offer. I've done a lot of copy editing, so I said, well, I'll read it while you write it and copy edit. Leah turned this out at the rate of a chapter a week, the fall before last. I was buried in reading and fascinated, and it was wonderful. This is a really important book for everybody to read. And there's another book that's a companion to it, Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance and the Black Freedom Movement by Monica White, which is a much more academic book, but it introduces us to the academic world of Black agronomy and to the world of Black cooperatives and the work of Fannie Hamer in particular. So it should be on everybody's reading list. Farming While Black and this book are about the struggle for racial justice and equality, and it really adds to our understanding of culture and history. Leah brilliantly integrates practical farming know-how with diasporic culture, honoring ancestors, important projects, and great recipes. And I've tried some of them out, and I recommend them. But they take a lot more time to cook than she says, or at least at my rate of chopping. So after reading these two books, we have to change the organic canon, that list of old white men and one woman who we honor as the teachers of organic agriculture. I mean, we can still love Rudolph and Sir Albert Howard and Lady Balfour, but we have to put right up there George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. The racial divide has prevented us from knowing these incredible teachers. And they have so much more to teach us because they were trying to solve an even more difficult problem, which was how do you help sharecroppers, people who are farming and feeding their families, surrounded by the most intense racism, but who have the most modest resources to feed their families well, be able to purchase their lands, and to make successful farms. So in these trying times, when we are afflicted by many hard things, we need to turn to these people who've had it even harder and learn from them. Leah makes contributions to us understanding also how many millions of peasants in Haiti, in Africa, but also Europe and Asia created the farming that we do. So these people are unnamed, but we are farming in their tradition. So Leah is a deeply principled person, exemplary in what she does. She does it all with care and thoroughness, and we are so fortunate to have her as one of our teachers. So it's my great pleasure to welcome her to our podium today.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was deeply thoughtful and caring and full of love. And I feel like you already said all the things, so we should just take a nap. That was great. Hi, everyone. I'm Leah, Soulfire Farm. And, NOFA was one of my first crews, so to speak, as well. I did not intend to be a farmer. I fell in love with the earth at a very young age, mostly because it was hard to get along with the other children in my school. Our family was the only melaninated family in the whole town of Ashburnham, Massachusetts, very working class, pretty conservative town. And, nobody wanted to be our friends. In fact, folks, they beat us up, they teased us, we weren't allowed to date, get in trouble with the popular kids. And so what we did, the three of us, is we just made friends with the trees. We would go out in the woods and quite literally hug trees and play in the forest and make forts. And I had read that book, My Side of the Mountain. Did you all read that book? And so I was going to try to live in a tree. And we made it 36 hours in the woods, eating wood sorrel and like these little fish that we had caught. But then we got hungry and we came home, So I was really into the earth, but I didn't grow up farming. And the reason that I found farming is because I needed a summer job. And there was a flyer and there was, someone with enough foresight to think, wouldn't it be neat? Back in the early 90s, wouldn't it be neat to create this farming program that's also youth development and bring together Black and brown and white children, urban, suburban children, and they can learn to grow food and serve the community and value of work. And that was before every city had a youth farming program. It was one of the first years of the food project. And I tell you, you probably have all had an experience like this, but from that first moment of, you look down a row of crops and you see all those little weeds coming up and someone puts a stirrup hoe in your hand and you clean that all out and look back and see what you did, and the calluses that you earned, that was it. I was totally hooked on farming. I've been farming 22 years. I never stopped farming. And as you mentioned, many hands and so on. It was actually my husband at Live Power. I didn't go to Live Power. That's a whole other story. But I got, honestly, pretty disillusioned. I've gone to NOFA conferences since 96, NOFA Math, the summer conference. And after a few years of it, I was excited. I would go to the fermentation one, and then I would go learn about cover crops and trying to figure out how I was going to live on the land and how much land you need to feed a family. But time and again, it was there was almost nobody who looked like me or darker than me. It was all of the presenters were white. All the authors in the back of the book, I would flip it over and see who wrote it. And I was having this internal conflict about, did I choose the wrong thing to do? Because did I miss the memo? Am I supposed to be here? And there was one particular NOFA summer conference when I went around to everybody who appeared to be Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, and gave them a little slip of paper and said, meet at 1 o'clock in this spot. And there was maybe 9 of us, in the whole, however many people go to NOFA. And one of those people was Karen Washington. Karen Washington, if you don't know, is one of the farmers at Rise and Root Farm, and now one of the conveners of the Black Urban Growers and Black Farmers Conference. And she said to me, she's my elder, she's in her 60s now, but she's like, don't give up. You belong here, and you are part of this story, and we're going to figure out how to rewrite the narrative so that you know that and everyone else knows that. And so that was a turning point for me, and I didn't quit. I did urban farming, eventually started Soulfire, which I'll talk about. And the reason I wrote Farming While Black is because I want that next generation of folks coming up who want to farm to know that they've always belonged. And there's so much more to the narrative of our relationship to Earth than what's circumscribed by oppression, right? That there's so much more dignity and belonging and agency and innovation, and that we get to claim that as part of our heritage. So we're going to do some storytelling tonight. And in Haiti, which is where my maternal lineage is from, when it's story time, the storyteller says creek, and everyone responds crack. So creek, creek, ashe. We're going to thank our ancestors. That's what we always do when we start out our story time as well. And in this moment, I want to call in Susie Boyd. I don't know her true name. That is the name that those who called themselves masters named her. But Susie Boyd is my grandma's grandma's grandma. And best I can tell from the records, it was late 1700s, early 1800s when she was taken from the shores of Dahomey, West Africa, and brought to Rock Hill, South Carolina to work as an unpaid laborer in rice and later in cotton. And what she did before she was taken, and what other women, other grandmothers in the community and mothers and children did before they were taken, is they took their molokia and their rice and their okra and their goosey melon and their sorghum seed that they had saved for generations, and they made a part in their hair and placed the seed in the part and braided over again and again in patterns so that they would have their most precious insurance for an uncertain future. They believed that we would exist, right? There was no report backs. I've gone and lived in Ghana, West Africa, and asked folks, like, what was that like to be on the other side of things, people getting taken? And it was confusing and terrifying because nobody actually knew where people were going. They never came back to say what happened. So to save a seed in that moment, I'm like, I got nothing to complain about. So I want to call them into the room and also invite you to think of an ancestor who had foresight to help you be who you are today. And we're going to call their names into the room at the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Harriet Tubman. Hey, we got to do that again. It needs to be way louder. 1, 2, 3. Harriet Tubman. Ashe. Thank you so much. I also want to give thanks in this moment to the folks who stewarded this land for 10,000 plus years before most of us ever got here. My understanding is where we're on right now is the confluence and the overlap of Stockbridge, Munsee, Mohican territory as well as Mohawk territory. And unless we belong to those nations, even if we are indigenous to somewhere else, which we all are, we are enjoying some settler privilege because of the displacement of people, the clearing out of people, mostly in the 1800s, the genocide of people. And I know it's kind of gotten to be hip to name that, but I would encourage us to think about whoever's land that we're on, how can we be in allyship and solidarity with their work? And that's gonna look different. Sometimes it might look like sharing the land, giving the land. In the case of the Mohican folks, one of the things that we're working out is something called voluntary taxation. It was started by Native folks in Southern California, but the idea is to take a percentage of what you're paying on your property tax and send it to the community. So the Stockbridge Munsee are on a reservation in Wisconsin for the most part, and so what we're doing is we're taking our percentage of our property tax and tithing it back, reparating it back to the community. But it's about building relationships and asking, how can we support you? Do I need to chain myself to a pipeline? Like, what do I need to do to help you get your freedom? I think that's very important. And my last shout out is to the team. And thank you for mentioning, Elizabeth, that it's always a we thing. I'm not even the farm manager anymore because there's so much teaching to do, which is super exciting. But, a shout out to Larissa for holding down the crop planning and Jonah for holding down the buildings and everyone on our team. So let's look back in time a little bit because as important as it is for all of us to reclaim the ways that we're connected to the earth, right? And to redefine the sanctity of that, we can't ignore the fact that the environmental benefits of being connected to the earth aren't fairly distributed. And the environmental harms of being disconnected from the earth also are not fairly distributed, that there's a racial inequity as well as a class inequity, and all of this isn't to say that everyone doesn't suffer in some ways. But it's very important for us to look at what's true in order to figure out how to heal it. So we're gonna take just a little journey through history to understand how the food system got the way it is, and then what's being done about it and how we can all plug in to make NOFA and every organization like ours, and by extension the whole food system, really fair for everyone, right? So we talk about the seed braids, right? And this is a very spiritual story for me, to think about not only the seeds being braided into the hair of Susie Boyd and all the women in the community before they were forced to board transatlantic slave ships, but also to think like braiding is a cultural act of transmission. I don't know if some folks in your family, you sit down between your mother's knees, right? She might thwap your head with the side of the brush if you're being too wiggly. And as the braiding gets done, which takes some time, there are stories, there's knowledge, there's culture. And so my vision of what's happening then is all this wisdom's getting passed about how we behave in relationship to the earth. Because Black folks were part of inventing a whole lot of technologies we take for granted as ahistorical or European, right? Soil testing, using your tongue to tell what the pH is, and the texture by feel from the Yoruba people. Right? Vermicompost, worms, vermicompost from Cleopatra, 69 BCE. She was a person who had a whole cadre of priests dedicated to the full-time study of the earthworm, right? African dark earth, which is very much like terra preta. It's a combination of bone char and ash and food scraps that helps you measure the depth of the community, the age of the community by its depth because it's so nutrient rich. Permaculture, polycropping, comes from many systems throughout Africa, one of them called the Jardin Lakou, when you can mix in the herbs together with the trees and the annuals and the livestock and have this self-sufficient system, this self-sustaining system. Terraces, crop rotation, irrigation, rotational grazing, the chicken, the pig, right? Preserving your food, growing your crops in raised beds so that the soil warms earlier and so that you're able to have channels to control the water. The work party, the credit union, festivals for harvest. So many things that we kind of integrate and do have these really profound roots. And I imagine our ancestors braiding that knowledge into their hair. But the project of settler colonialism is to erase. It's to make us forget. It's to take away that connection, to alienate us from each other and from the earth. Right? So I'm going to make the argument that the food system is not broken, that it's actually working exactly as it was designed. And it was designed on a DNA of stolen land and exploited labor. And I believe that we still are operating a food system fundamentally off of that DNA of stolen land and exploited labor. Does anyone know what this picture is? What is it? Manifest Destiny. What is that? Go ahead.
The idea that white Protestants came in believing that they had the right to the land and that
Yep.
they would better the land by bringing God.
Yeah, excellent. So I'll sort of repeat back because it's a little bit hard to hear. But this idea of manifest destiny actually didn't start, this painting is an 1800s painting, but it started in 1455 out of the Catholic Church. Pope Nicholas at the time put out a papal bull that said, white Christian nations, go forth, enslave, colonize, and pillage heathen nations. It was the beginning of the Age of Discovery, Nina Pinta Santa Maria, all that stuff, right? This concept of the doctrine of discovery actually became codified in US law. In 1823, the Supreme Court upheld the doctrine of discovery. It is nicknamed the Finders Keepers Law. And the idea is that when a white Christian comes to a new land, a new territory, if it's non-Christians and non-white folks who are there, if you plant a flag, that's yours. It became the basis for expansion, for dispossession of native people from their territories, whether or not there was a treaty, and for genocide. And it would be one thing, it would be one kind of tragedy if that was like a really long time ago and over. But the Supreme Court has upheld the doctrine of discovery many times, most recently in 2005. So the Oneida Nation sued the county for some of its territories back. And the Supreme Court went all the way up, and the Supreme Court said, I'm sorry, you, under the doctrine of discovery, you are a domestic dependent nation. You do not have sovereignty or any claims to your land. And so it's heartbreaking and terrifying how little I actually thought about this until I started organizing more with Native communities. The fact that folks still don't have their lands back and are still struggling all the time for their land, and oftentimes are completely isolated in that struggle and with their own communities. But it wasn't just the stolen land, right? The whole labor system to build up the $10 trillion worth of agricultural products during the early era of exploration came from enslaved Africans. About 12.5 million folks were stolen, 6 or 7 million ended up here. And it wasn't just random people getting kidnapped, right? Enslavers would target agricultural experts. If you read the work of Judith Kearney, Black Rice, really profound, because something I'd never thought about is the fact that the climate in the southeast of the United States and in the Caribbean and Brazil is tropical, subtropical. And the agriculture that Europeans were bringing with them didn't match that climate. And so it became imperative to find agriculturalists who knew how to deal with this amount of water, with these temperatures. And those were the people who were targeted and taken. They were the best farmers. So there was a decimation on the continent of the very best farmers being taken and then building the wealth here. But again, not ancient history, right? What happened in 1865 that we celebrate on June 19th? Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment. If you haven't watched the documentary 13th, definitely check it out. Ava DuVernay. But the 13th Amendment had this loophole in it, essentially. It's still there. You can look on Wikipedia right now. I'm telling you all true things, nothing sensationalist. But the 13th Amendment says slavery is outlawed, it's abolished, except in the case if you've been convicted of a crime. So what happened in the South is because it would have been so devastating to the economy to just have everyone go free like that and get their own land, even though people tried to do that, there had to be a way to keep folks on the plantation. So all the states in the South implemented what's called black codes. They were a new set of laws that included things like vagrancy, not having a job, loitering, means standing around, and other crimes like not being upright and honest, or not following church protocol, not getting off the sidewalk out of the way for white people to pass. And so people were getting rounded up. It's interesting if you actually look at the graphs of how many folks were in prison, harvest time, lots of people were suddenly being convicted of crimes. And the reason being is that at the same time, convict leasing came into being. And this is when the state takes incarcerated people and leases them for a fee back to the plantation, to the mine, and to the railroad. Not insignificant. Alabama, from 1866 to 69, 73% of their state budget came from leasing out black people to plantations. And if you look at what our young black men are getting rounded up for their first offense these days, truancy, vagrancy, loitering. So these became tools to control a segment of the population and keep them as an economic resource and to uphold the status quo. Of course, folks who were not being incarcerated still were living in serfdom, essentially the system of tenant farming or sharecropping, where you're on the plantation and your house is on loan, your seed is on loan, your tools are on loan, and then you owe back to the landowner at the end of the year a portion of the crop, sometimes 110% of the crop. So you're in a state of perpetual debt, and you can't break contract. That's a crime. You'll go to jail. And so there's a enforcement of remaining in that state of bondage. And something that was so astounding to me is even in the face of that, even in the face of this terror and constraint that I almost can't imagine, black farmers saved up money to buy between 15 and 16 million acres of land by 1910. And this wasn't giveaway land. Like that 40 acres and a mule thing, that was a really good idea. There were 30 black pastors who got together to meet with General Sherman of the Union Army, during Reconstruction. And General Sherman was like, what do you all need? They said, we need land. That's it. We need land. We'll even pay for it, but just let us pay for it over time. And if it could be away from the former slave masters, that for at least a generation, that would be helpful, because we think it will take a generation for them to uproot their hatred of us, is what the transcripts say from that. So they started this idea of really radical idea, social reparations, but Andrew Jackson was like, oh, no, give that land back to the rebel soldiers. So black folks had to, buy all this land with their Sunday money. And people got scared in the South about this, got really scared of the idea of black independence, competition, racial mixing, whatever those fears were, and responded with a rise of terror. 1910 was the peak of black land ownership in this country. It was also the peak of lynchings. In those decades, around between 4,000 and 4,500 people were lynched. And many of them were targeted for trying to own land or owning land. And because, that's just an astounding number of people to have their houses burned and to be strung up. But I want to read you just one paragraph of one of those people so we can humanize this story. So this was 1910. No, this was 1908. And trigger warning, this is about a lynching. So, it says, after midnight on October 4th, 1908, 50 hooded men surrounded the home of a black farmer in Hickman, Kentucky, and ordered him to come out for a whipping. When David Walker refused and shot at them instead, the mob poured coal oil on his house and set it afire, according to contemporary newspaper accounts. Pleading for mercy, Walker ran out the front door, followed by 4 screaming children and his wife, carrying a baby in her arms. The mob shot them all, wounding 3 children and killing the others. Walker's oldest son never escaped the burning house. No one was ever charged with the killings, and the surviving children were deprived of the farm their father died defending. Land records show that Walker's 2.5-acre farm was simply folded into the property of a white neighbor. The neighbor sold it to another man whose daughter owns the undeveloped land today. And this came out of an Associated Press investigation that has 406 such case studies that amounted to 24,000 acres of land just in a couple states in the South. So something that I think about here, you've all heard of the Great Migration, right? It's like 6 million Black people went from the South to the North, supposedly to get jobs during the war, seek opportunity. And while that is true, you know, the part of the story that I never understood was that it was a refugee crisis. It wasn't that Black people didn't want to farm anymore. It's that it was, you risk your life to farm. And if there's an opportunity to get out of there, you're going to get out of there rather than have your house burned down or get strung up. And so that land was stolen and continues to be stolen. So as Black people leave the South, there's a labor vacuum. And this was an opportunity for the United States to be like, let's rethink this whole stolen land, exploited labor thing. You know, that's old. Maybe we should give some land back and pay fair wages. But unfortunately, that wasn't how it worked. It was just like, who else? Who can we get to do this now? Does anyone know what happened in the early 1900s to replace the Black labor force in the South? Actually was. In the late 1800s, it was Chinese and Filipino workers. But then it was officially became a program in 1940 called the Bracero program. It's had many incarnations. The guest worker program in this country has many incarnations. One of them is now the H-2A, which needs a lot of reform because the challenge, there's so many challenges with H-2A and guest worker programs, but part of it is that we have one whole set of laws for most American workers and then another set of laws for farm workers and domestic workers. And this started in 1935 with the New Deal, really the golden age of progressivism in many ways. We had Social Security, we had child labor protections for the first time, we had a maximum number of hours for the workday and overtime pay and the right to unionize. And those Southern Democrats would not vote for this package if it included Black and brown people. And you can now, because of FOIA, you can read those transcripts. They would not vote for it. So the compromise was to exclude agricultural workers and domestic workers from that legislation. And to this day, if you look at the National Labor Relations Act and other legislation for worker protection, there's separate rules, separate minimum wage, right? If you, on the federal scale, if you work for a farm with less than seven employees, you don't even have a minimum wage. There's no minimum wage, right? You can have children working, pesticide exposures, and all this danger for folks. And what's heartbreaking about it is that the entire food system would collapse without the guest worker program. It's like 80 to 85% of our food is grown by people who identify as Latinx and Hispanic. Only about 2% of our farms are managed by folks who are Latinx and Hispanic, right? A friend of mine who teaches farming out in the Midwest said that he once asked a whole room like this of his students, how much would you need to be paid to work at the meat packing plant in town? What do you think they said? What hourly would you take to be a meat packer? $30 an hour? Anyone else? 75? Okay. 20? So 100% of his students were like, no money. There was no amount of money you could pay me to work at that meatpacking plant. It's like 3,000 hogs an hour. It's dangerous. It's disgusting. It's grueling, repetitive stress. Like, I don't want to do that job. And besides, that's Mexican work. Right? That was what they said. And there's something profound in that statement because we have to ask ourselves, like, what kind of food system have we created where we have to have international trade agreements that are so onerous and oppressive that they force indigenous people off of their ancestral territories, right, to come to a hostile place to do work that we don't want to do for any amount of money so our food system can run, right? And why are we calling them farm workers and not farmers also? Why are we not in the same room? So these are some very deep questions we have to ask ourselves. And at the same time as, you know, Black farmers were moving to the north, there were definitely folks who were trying to hold on to their land. And the challenge is that, you know, farming is a really highly subsidized, highly regulated industry. The USDA is supposed to help us out with crop allotments and crop insurance. We're supposed to have technical assistance. But at the county level, when a black farmer would go in with a loan application for irrigation after a drought, time and again, those applications would be denied, they'd be delayed, they'd be lost. And during the civil rights movement, this was especially bad. Quite literally, people would go into the office and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, did I hear that you tried to register to vote yesterday? My, well, I can't seem to find your application today, now can I?" Of course, black farmers sued the federal government and settled out of court in '99 the Pigford versus Glickman case in favor of the black farmers as the largest civil rights settlement in the history of the United States. But the Civil Rights Commission, in researching this history of discrimination, made the sad conclusion that the USDA was a principal driver in the extinction of the black farmer, they said in a 1982 report. So again, not an accident of history. And of course, we get up north and we're like, all right, now we're gonna do this thing. We're gonna be able to build intergenerational wealth, be able to buy some houses, have some community gardens. But there was a whole other form of land dispossession, land discrimination in the north called redlining. Again, 1930s, this was like the golden age, but the FHA commissioned these maps to be made of neighborhoods all around the country. And for black and brown neighborhoods, those neighborhoods were outlined in red, which indicated to banks too risky for lending. Other neighborhoods were graded from A to D. There was a color coding. The result of this was profound. Complete divestment in certain neighborhoods. Segregation, de facto segregation, because there were covenants, restrictive covenants in deeds that said, this property may never be sold to a black person, a brown person. We have to prevent inharmonious racial mixing. And ironically, I just purchased a 6-acre piece of property adjacent to ours last week. Long story about why. But there was a restrictive covenant on that deed that said it could not be sold to a black person. And the lawyer said, oh, so our job, I guess, I didn't know this, but property lawyers who help with buying stuff, their job is to strike that anytime there's a sale. But they never went through and cleaned up all the deeds. So in a lot of small towns, if something hasn't been sold for a while, you go and you see the deed and it literally said you cannot sell this to a black person. So what though, right? The results fundamentally is that we have a huge wealth gap because property is the main way that people pass on wealth. 80% of wealth is inherited. If you are the average white person in America today, you're going to be 16 times wealthier than the average black person at birth, right? 16 times, according to the Pew Research Center last year. When I was born, it was 8-1, so it's doubled in my lifetime. And this results in problems like food apartheid. Neighborhoods that are divested from, there's no grocery stores, there's no supermarkets, there's no farmers markets, there's plenty of emergency food in KFC. You got $3 in your pocket, you can get hot Cheetos and blue drink, but you can't get good food. And it's not about motivation. I lived in a food apartheid neighborhood in the south end of Albany before we started Soulfire. I've got a master's degree, I know how to farm, I'm smart, I can navigate stuff. I didn't have a car, and I had a baby and a 2-year-old. And there was nothing. There was no community garden. There was nothing. I ended up joining Denison Farm CSA, which dropped off at the Quaker Meeting House 2.2 miles up the hill. So I would put Emmett on the back, Nashima in the stroller, walk up to the Quaker Meeting House, get the vegetables, and walk 2.2 miles back home. And that cost as much as our rent, that CSA share. So that's not accessible. That's not reasonable. I was on WIC, and you get in line for women, infants, and children, and you can only buy this size eggs or this size cereal, and you have to put it back if you accidentally get the wrong size. People would yell at us. People would spit on us for holding up the line. So it's really a very, very tough situation. And again, not race neutral. Black child, 1 in 3 chance you're gonna go hungry tonight. A white child, 1 in 6. A white person, 4 times likely to have a supermarket in your neighborhood than a black person. Diabetes, heart disease, obesity, poor eyesight, ADHD, sleep apnea, all these diet-related illnesses disproportionately affect indigenous and black people, not because of bad choices, but because of access and because of this history. We talked about farm worker exploitation and disenfranchisement, and also land ownership. 1910 was the peak of black land ownership, and right now farming is the whitest profession, with veterinarians coming in as a close second. So to be like a farm manager is the whitest profession in the United States, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. And depending if how much you count reservations, between 95 and 98% of the land is controlled, the rural farmland is controlled by white folks. And it's just not fair. I'm not saying that we can't, what I am saying is that we all need to have access, right? We all need to have shared access to the environmental benefits and shared distribution of the environmental harms. It can't be concentrated in just one group of folks or a couple groups of folks. And you all know that at the same time as we're destroying the human community, we're trashing the planet, right? Climate change and water withdrawals and land use conversion, all that kind of stuff. And I'll argue in a moment that they're really linked. But before we get to what we're doing about it and what we all can do about it, because the great thing about a problem that's so pervasive and so deep-rooted is there's like 10,000 ways, points of intersection to fix it. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. But I want to give you a chance to talk to each other. Turn to the person next to you. Take about a minute each. And share one way that you see your ancestors in this history, or see your people, your folks connected to these events. So take a moment and talk to each other, and then we'll come back as a whole group. When I say free the people, you say free the lands, free the people. When I say free the people, you say free the land, free the people. Free the people by any means necessary. Because our freedom is intertwined with the freedom of the earth, isn't it? So let's hear from a couple folks who are feeling courageous about a way that you're connected to that story. And if you don't mind, just stand up and project if you want to share. We'll hear from 2 or 3 people. There's no right answer or wrong answer.
Hi, I'm Brianna. My dad is from Mexico, and he grew up in the city, but when he was born, and my family there, they lived in land that was redistributed after the Mexican Revolution. And much like land here, when it gets redistributed, it wasn't, they didn't get back the land that they originally had. They got back crappy land. So I went back about 6 years ago and got to check it out and visit with my family there and see the land. So that's kind of where I see my ancestors fitting into that.
So my family has been here since with the Mayflower. I am sorry to say that I do have ancestors that owned slaves in the South, and we were also involved in the Oklahoma land grab in the mid-1800s, where we took a lot of land away from the Native Americans. So my family does have a sad history of oppressing a lot of people.
My mother's side of the family is from Luxembourg and immigrated in 1848. Oh, thank you. And immigrated in 1848, fleeing religious wars. And in Luxembourg, only the landed class could have access to lumber resources. And so Luxembourg was effectively deforested. When they settled in southeastern Wisconsin, the only way that they could clear farmland, that it was so densely forested and they had too much wood, so they had to burn it. They couldn't do anything with it. And the story goes that the women that had settled there were weeping at this sort of tremendous waste of resources. What's never written in that particular story, and what I've just sort of had to intimate and read between the lines, is that that land was so densely forested because it had been previously cleared of people. So there's no, at least in our histories, there's no written record of what the interactions were like with the native peoples there, but I think the effects of it are pretty clear.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that we're clapping for both stories of ways our ancestors were harmed and maybe stories of ways our ancestors were complicit. Because all of it has a place in unraveling really what is true. And without full truth, I don't think we can move forward in our healing. So thank you for that. And my ancestors did all kinds of really harmful things and also were harmed. And many of us have both of those, right, in our lineages. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Soulfire, and by extension, what Black and Brown folks are doing to rewrite this story with the support of allies. And there's a beautiful teaching in the Talmud in Pirkei Avot that says, while you are not obligated to complete the task, neither are you free to desist from it. And that task being tikkun olam, heal and repair of the world. Which I love, because if we try to think about healing like centuries of genocide and enslavement and mass incarceration and all of that, we're going to not only burn out, we're going to get really discouraged and just be unable to take a step. But if it takes hundreds and hundreds of years to put together an oppressive system, it's going to take at least a couple generations to unravel it. So like seed keepers, we're thinking in a different time scale in the work that we do to heal. So at Soulfire, we figured the one place that's the intersection of what the world needs and what we know how to do and what we love to do is this idea of feeding ourselves, of self-determination in community. And Fannie Lou Hamer puts this much better than I ever could. Fannie Lou Hamer says, if you have 400 quarts of greens and gumbo soup canned for the winter, no one can push you around or tell you what to do, right? And so we're trying to build up those 400 quarts of greens and gumbo soup in our own community. So Soulfire, we started as a little family farm. We got our land in 2006. As my friend Elizabeth mentioned, it's pretty marginal, sloped, highly eroded. All the people said you couldn't farm there, but it was $2,000, less than $2,000 an acre. So we could afford it. And that's what we did. It took us a long time to build up the soil and build the house with our 2 hands and 4 hands. But now we're a community farm. And so we have a nonprofit. We also have a business, some staff, people live there. And we take the teachings of our spiritual teachers in Ghana, West Africa, the Queen Mothers. They say, late ete no no da. And that proverb means 3 stones make the cooking pot stand firm. 3 stones. And so there's 3 main projects that we're working on to help uplift our community. And the first is what we're all doing here, the most important. We're growing food for our community. And we're doing that in a way that makes sure that food is a basic right and not a privilege for the few. So we started out with just 20 CSA members right on our block where we used to live. Our neighbors are the ones who asked us to start Soulfire. They were like, wait, y'all know how to farm? And you're holding back, And we do everything, doorstep delivery. It's sliding scale so people can afford it. We give completely free shares to refugees and immigrants and folks impacted by mass incarceration, but we don't subsidize those shares. People's neighbors pay for the share, right? So it's called solidarity shares. And this food that we grow is all grown in a way that uses these Afro-Indigenous practices. We're doing cover cropping and raised beds and pastured poultry and so on and so forth. And it's good to remember that we didn't start these ideas. Just as much as we went over this whole timeline of oppression, we could go through a similar and even more robust timeline of resistance. And we want to build on those ancestors who remembered the original instructions, right? So this idea of feeding your community, we're inspired by these folks when we do that. Anyone know what this picture is? That's the Panthers, right? Berkeley, California, or Oakland, California. They fed 20,000 children every morning, free breakfast, right? The federal government thought that was a cool idea. They were like, wait, breakfast, let's do a free breakfast program, right? So the Black Panthers are definitely known for armed self-defense, which is an important part of their platform. But most of their resources and time was spent on health clinics, grocery distribution, giving rides to elders, and feeding children. It was survival programs. And so similarly, we're the foundation of everything we do has to be survival programs, not this theoretical activism, this real roll up your sleeves, provide for your community type of activism. Same thing with our farming. We learned very much from Jack and Julie at NOFA, this idea of carbon sequestration through farming and making sure that we minimize our fossil fuel use and call the life back into the soil. When colonizers got to the Great Plains, the average organic matter was between 8 and 10%. 1 generation later, it was cut in half. 1 generation of plowing, of tilling, and it was cut in half. And that's the first time you see in those CO2 charts in the atmosphere, that's the first spike of anthropogenic climate change. Not fossil fuel burning, it was tillage, right? So we really think about calling the carbon, calling the life back into the soil. And also not just the techniques and practices of our ancestors in the physical plane, but in the spiritual plane too, right? We all have this disease in common that we think everything's interconnected. We have this disease in common that we think the earth is actually alive and not just a material thing to be extracted from, that there's reciprocity. And so we sing, we dance, we do ceremony, we pour libation, we ask permission and consent. We give reverence and homage to the seed. And our vegetables are damn good. And our soil is not. So I'm telling you, there's another element, right? There's a psycho-spiritual element. And this very much comes from our Afro-Indigenous lineages. And these regenerative practices, I mean, they're really, really old. They're like 10,000 years old. But some of the first folks, some of the OGs of organic agriculture in this country, the professors who got up and took the scorn and the criticism for telling people to throw away the fertilizer and the monocrop, they came out of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. They came out of a black institution, right? The idea of extension agencies came out of a black institution. It was the schoolhouse on wheels going to the farmer. Right? This gentleman over here on the left-hand side, does anyone know his name? That's George Washington Carver. If you look up children's book about him, it's all about the peanut and like 1,000 peanut products, right? But the reason he was so into the peanut is because it's a legume, and legumes are these magical alchemists that make a deal with soil bacteria to turn atmospheric nitrogen into organic compounds. And so he was teaching folks cover cropping, a generation before Rodale. He said, your main project in the fall is you need to go get the muck from the swamps and the leaves from the forest and make compost piles, and then you got to do this rotational cover crop thing, and the whole point is to feed the soil, not the plant. That's what we need to be paying attention to. Also a professor at Tuskegee, Mr. Booker T. Watley, was noticing that it was really tough to make a living in commodity crops in wholesale market. So he was trying to coach farmers to create these diversified systems where you have vegetables and fruits, right? Now we just take that for granted as a thing, but that was not a thing then. He was like, here, you're going to get city folks to become members of your farm, right? They're going to pay a subscription. And then they'll come out to your farm and harvest for you and pay you, right? And we'll call it pick your own, right? We'll call it pick your own. We'll call it the clientele membership club. And to make it even more appealing, how about a weekly newsletter to let people know, what's happening on the farm and help them feel connected like it's really their farm. And again, people thought he was nuts. But how many people have a newsletter for their farm? How many people have a membership, things like a CSA? And so these were very, very important thinkers in terms of sustainable agriculture. Just as we honor ancestral practices in growing food, we also honor ancestral practices in our buildings. It took a lot of time, but we built our home and our barn out of the stuff of the land. The wood, the clay, the straw bales. It took a long time. I was lucky that I was in my early 20s when we started, because there was a moment when my husband and I, we were digging the foundation, and we didn't have enough money to hire an excavator. So we had our little tractor with this busted backhoe. We tried that. It didn't work through our hard pan clay. So we just took out shovels and pickaxes. It took us months to dig the foundation. Months. And it's a passive solar house. And so it's got to face which way? South. I was not paying attention in middle school earth science about this thing called magnetic declination. Magnetic declination is the fact that actual self is like 13 degrees off of magnetic self. So if you use a compass to orient your foundation, you did it wrong. So we realized this when we're like 90% on the foundation. And I'm like crying in the hole. I'm like, I just can't. Our children were really young. I just can't. There's like literally blood coming down the knuckles from like all the pickaxing. And luckily, we're both really stubborn. So my husband was just like, well, do you want to quit? And I was like, never. Do you want to quit? Never. So we're like, all right, we just need to dig. Just keep digging. But all that to say, it takes time. It takes patience, right? So the second thing we're up to is like training up this next generation of farmer activists. And, this came actually from a phone call. Everything we do at Soulfire is because community asked us to do it. That's what accountability means to us. That's why we have a CSA. But I got a call about a year in from this amazing woman, Coffee Dixon in Boston. And she's like, I just need to hear your voice because I'm about to quit farming. I'm a Black woman. I can't find a training program. I can't get into an incubator farm. People giving me funny looks at NRCS. Like, I just need to know that you exist. And by the way, can you have an apprenticeship? Can you have something? So we started these training programs for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian folks. And like one Facebook post filled up at another session, another Facebook post filled up. No recruitment, no reach out. And it's powerful because I really believed that our folks were not interested in farming, that we had like fled the red clays of Georgia on purpose. We get 5 applications for every spot, and we take 150 people a year through this program. We get 5 applications for every spot. Our folks are the returning generation. They want to farm. And people learn this, and they go back to their communities, and whether it's urban or rural, doesn't make a difference. If you are providing and feeding your community and standing up for food justice, we're like just so proud to be associated. But again, we didn't come up with this, right? This idea of having this community farm and educating and sharing. Anyone know any of these folks in the picture? Fannie Lou Hamer. So we talked about her, the greens and gumbo soup. She's very famous for her Democratic Party organizing, but she also started Freedom Farm Cooperative. 70-family intentional community with a farm and a pig bank. So the idea with a pig bank is you get a pregnant sow, it has some piglets, and then you keep some, and some go on to a neighbor. And with the proceeds of their vegetables, they were able to fund scholarships and burial fees and housing and all kinds of support for the community, right? And raise up the next generation of farmers. The Sherrods, Shirley and Charles Sherrod, started the first ever community land trust in the United States. 6,000 acres in Albany, Georgia in 1969. 500 families were involved. They were farming, they ran a farmers market, co-ops, trained farmers. And of course, they were such a threat, to white folks in the South. Their offices were actually bombed, their fertilizer was diluted, and they were denied loans. They became some of the lead plaintiffs in the Pigford case that I mentioned that was settled. So we're building on a legacy. And we get to hang out with farmers like Keisha Cameron, who's a hog farmer in Georgia, who came up to our program. She was like, I'm about to quit farming. But this being with you all, being in community and seeing it's connected to this powerful higher purpose. I'm going to go back to Georgia and I'm going to work with hog farmers to convert them to organic and support them. Something to mention too that was so profound and just unexpected about these training programs is I'm sitting here trying to train people on I love soil science. So I'm like, let's nerd out about cation exchange capacity and really get our texture just right. And is this a compost tea situation, or is it some other kind of amendment we need? And then people in their evals would be like, I left a toxic marriage because of this program. I left a, dead-end job. I lost 100 pounds. I got off cocaine. I was like, this is a farm training. Like, what is going on? Like, all these evaluations are like it's a therapy program. And there's something that I realized, in all of this is like in African cosmology, indigenous cosmology, we really believe that the earth is a source of wisdom and healing, super alive. Our ancestors are under the earth. And when we have our bare feet on the ground, we get messages. Like all those trees that are talking to each other through the mycelium and passing their sugars and passing their warning signs. When we're in touch with that, we're listening to how they're cooperating and getting messages about how we need to cooperate. That's part of our cosmology. And the earth is in here calling us home like, I have the answers for you. I can really help you heal. I can help you fill that place in your soul where you can't remember what you even forgot. That ache that you have, that yearning that is unnameable. I got you. And so in the reintroduction to the land in a safe and whole way, we're not just learning soil science, we're actually learning who we were meant to be. And Harriet Tubman knew that. The whole way north, she was using herbs and prayer and trees and moss to help folks stay unafraid and courageous and to believe that they deserved freedom. That's why she never lost anyone, because she had the earth as her ally. The third thing that we're working on is movement building. And again, we only do what the community asks us to do. So this came out of some elders of mine. I know a lot of civil rights veterans, including my mom. Long story, but my mom essentially saved a starving child in South Carolina doing voter registration. And so these civil rights elders in my life really challenge me because they're like, that without land owning Black farmers, there would be no Civil Rights Act. there would be no voting rights, which I didn't understand. But they explained to me that if you were a sharecropper or a tenant farmer and you tried to register to vote, you get kicked right off your land. That's actually why the charade started new communities, is because they needed a place for the tenant farmers to go who'd been kicked off for registering to vote. If you own your own land, you can take a risk. You can join the NAACP, you can sign a petition, you can register to vote. But not only that, you had all these rabble-rousing Northerners coming down, trying to do this voter registration. Where were they gonna stay? The hotel? Where were they gonna eat? The local restaurant? You know? So the landowning black farmers put up that whole community. And one of my elders, Baba Halfkenny, was saying that they would have these fake Bible studies inside of the homes of the black farmers. So if you looked in the window, you would see Bibles, but inside the Bibles were these pamphlets, like voter pamphlets, like that. So they were organizing. He further said that when the night riders tried to come and get the activists and string them up, that they would cut down the trees to block the road so they couldn't get by and give the activists enough time to escape. And if they did get caught and thrown in jail, they would leverage their land as collateral for bail money to get them out. So there would literally be no civil rights movement without landowning black farmers, right? None. It's the basis of freedom, of independence. That's what Malcolm X said, land. And so my elders are like, so what are you doing at the farm again? You just a little CSA? Like, get it together, right? And so we started working harder on that, really looking at what does systemic change look like? What is it like to really bring allies, bring white folks into the conversation to make sure we have a whole reparations framework where we're getting land and resources back to people from whom it was stolen. We built this tool called the reparations map. Black Indigenous folks put up projects on the map. Reparations-minded people with resources of all races contribute. We've had 13 people get land through this voluntary matchmaking system. We're also really excited. We're working on a regional land trust together with Indigenous communities throughout New England and upstate New York. It's powerful work because there's a lot of mistrust, rightfully so, between Black Indigenous communities and within Indigenous community. But we're forming a land trust, and that land trust will allow people to donate lands. We put a conservation easement for ag, as well as a cultural easement to allow perpetual access for Native tribes to that land forever, and then give out ground leases to the community. So we're in the formation stages of that project. And we're also working nationally on policy change through some great alliances like the Heal Food Alliance and the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance and the NOFA Policy Council. And you know, we didn't make that up either. Shout out to Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Larry Eats Leong, the Immokalee workers, right? Our people have always been organizing, just always been organizing. And we extend this work internationally too, which I won't get into too much unless folks are interested in the questions. But I do want to mention that peasant farmers around the world provide the model of what it looks like to build a resilient food system. I've been very fortunate to be able to go to my homeland of Haiti and work with the peasant farmers there. I don't know if folks know, but in 2013, these farmers won the Global Food Sovereignty Prize. Amazing farmers. And they save their own seed, heritage varieties. They got a peanut co-op. There's lots of stuff we work on, irrigation. But what happened is after the earthquake, the way disaster capitalism kind of works is that, the US, other Western nations will swoop in with donations, right? Very carefully timed donations. So barge loads of rice at the time when the rice harvest is coming in. Free rice at a time when farmers are trying to sell rice. It's part of our Tide Aid policy. It's actually in the Farm Bill. And this is contracted out to private companies. So Monsanto is bringing rice seed that requires all their products, which they'll happily provide for free for the first year. And then after that, you're hooked. Your seed supply is dwindled, and you're dependent on them for seed. The Haitian farmers were like, oh, hell no. They burned that ish at the port. They were like, we don't want Monsanto rice. We don't want it. We don't want your rice. We have our own seed. And so we learn from them. So I tell the story of Soulfire not because what we're doing is so profound or centrally important, but just as a case study that there's so many ways to engage. There's so many points of intersection, and there's many, many right answers. And so just a few things that I would love for us to discuss in the sort of back and forth in Q&A is how can we as a network of people who deeply care about justice and deeply care about the earth, how can we advance food sovereignty? And just a couple of seeds to get planted in that conversation is that it's essential to follow the lead of people impacted by an issue when you're talking about the issue, right? So if we're dealing with anti-Semitism, who are we going to listen to? Jewish people, right? If we're talking about veterans' rights and supporting veterans, who are we going to listen to? Veterans. If we're talking about racism, who do we need to follow the lead of and listen to? Folks of color, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian folks. It's just logical because people impacted by an issue are experts in that issue. They know exactly what's happening, exactly what needs to change. And that can be the hardest switch because so often we get this sort of savior complex where we think, oh, I know what y'all need. You need a cooking class in your hood, right? Or you need a food truck, you need something, and I'm gonna kind of garner resources and make it happen, and you should be really grateful because I care about you. When in fact, there's all this amazing organizing already going on that we can just ask and support. So that's sort of fundamental. Also self-education. If like a lot of this stuff was totally new, or even if it wasn't, just like reading and learning and continuing to deepen, because it can be exhausting also for folks who are impacted by issues to have to like always explain the basics. So it's easy. It's like the age of the internet. You can find all this stuff. And then working on policy. You know, many of us are voters. We have access to our representatives. And there's a beautiful policy, many beautiful policy platforms. One that we put together at Soulfire that's about farm worker rights. It's about food access. It's about supporting Black and brown farmers through USDA programs, making it harder for people to lose their land through air property theft and so on. And so, you know, check that out and make a meeting with your representative, with your senator, and say, hey, where do you stand on these issues? How can we move? So those are some things to think about. And I just want to put faces to names just to super emphasize that it's like already happening and we have an opportunity to jump in. You know, I mentioned Karen Washington. Well, we got Baba Malik out in Detroit, Giovanna and Eugene in Atlanta, Dennis Derrick in Schoharie County, our DC crew with Katrina Baxter, you know, Gail Myers, who's in Florida now. There's a lot of Black and brown farmers who are just doing the most, doing amazing, amazing work. And we can really support them. It doesn't always have to be like, how do we get more people to our table? It's like, how do we build a table together? So I'm gonna close the talking at you portion with a poem. And I'm gonna ask my comrade, Tanya Noel, to come up here with me to help me read this poem, if you would. Thank you so much. And Rosa, you too. Come on up. See what you can do.
Never mind, you can't tell one letter from another.
Never mind you were born a slave. Never mind you lose your name. Never mind your daddy dead. Never mind. No.
This here is what a man can do if he puts his mind to it and his back in it.
Stop sniveling, the land said. Stop picking around the edges of the world. Take advantage, and if you can't take advantage, take disadvantage.
We live here, on this planet, in this nation, in this country right here, nowhere else.
We got a home in this rock, don't you see?
Nobody's starving in my home. Nobody crying in my home. And if I got a home, you got one too.
Grab it. Grab this land.
Take it, hold it, my brothers. Make it, my sisters. Shake it, squeeze it, turn it, twist it, beat it, kick it, kiss it, whip it, stomp it, dig it, plow it, seed it, reap it, rent it, buy it, sell it, own it, build it, multiply it, and pass it on.
Can you hear me? Pass it on.
Thank you. Nice job. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, I don't think they're giving us the hook for like another 15 minutes or so. So if anyone has any questions, comments, ideas, we can have a dialogue. Wow, it was all super clear, I guess. Okay.
I went to your food and racism workshop about 2 years ago, and I think about it almost every day. And I put the practices that you shared with us into the practices of my life, and I've taken it to my organization. And it hasn't fully changed, but hopefully one day it can. So thank you for sharing your farm with me.
No, I was just asking for advice from one POC landowner to someone who hopes to aspire to be one day. I don't have the opportunity to be an heir to land, so I was hoping, what can I say to the youth that I'm working with, teaching them about farming, as to what they can look forward to as a farmer, or in the life of farming.
I feel like there's so many questions in that, you know? No, that's really beautiful. I mean, for young people who are maybe skeptical about the idea of farming, I've found two kind of lines of reasoning that are helpful. One is what we talked about in the workshop earlier today, is about all the ways that folks' ancestors have contributed to farming. So really uplifting like the genius. Like, do you know y'all people invented the sprinkler and irrigation and all of that? That gets some young people, the ones who are more historically minded. What works for others is sort of the spite motivation. So it's like, look, they took your lands, they took your language, they took your food, they took your traditions. You're gonna let them take your ancestral right to belong to land and have good food? You're gonna let them kill you off with the gun and kill you off with mass incarceration and police violence? Now you're gonna let them kill you off with the bad food too? No, we need to resist, right? On a practical level, getting access to land, like for us, I didn't inherit land. It was a mean hustle. Like we had 4 people living in one room in this nasty collective house, saving money for years and years and years before we were able to like purchase our land, and then we had to go into debt and all of that stuff. So I'm not gonna lie, it's like definitely a struggle to get access. But luckily through things, there's a lot of programs now, land trust programs and grants and revolving loans and things like that. So you can send your young folks to me. I have like a whole resource list and try to coach people on how to navigate the system so they can get it. Because there's a way, you know, it just takes a little bit of patience and fortitude. So thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to, I guess, give a shout out to those of us who participate in community farming. I was sharing with my neighbor here about how I come from an immigrant family from Haiti, and we were used to farming home, but when we came to this country in the 1950s and 60s, we did not have access to any land. And so my uncles kind of sought out ranches and opportunities in upstate New York so that our whole family can come together and make our foods and, you know, do the things that we would have normally have been doing at home, but we just didn't have access. And I just wanted to just share that there are some people out here, and those of you who do have access to land and who do have access to community, to turn your land into community, help open it up to people of color who may not have an opportunity. And so I'm very proud to say that I have been able to bring my child to a community farm in the exact same town that my parents and my uncles tried to be in when we were a kid because of these programs. And so I just wanted to to show that there are solutions out there, and everyone can do this kind of work and open up what they do have and know that there is enough for everyone. And we can, you know, the world is an abundant place, and we don't have, it's not a zero-sum game. There's enough for everybody, and we can really, everyone can play a part in sharing what they have.
Yeah.
Peace and blessings. Firstly, I want to thank everybody's angels and ancestors. You all sitting here, we all been born at the right time, at the right place to hear you speak. And we thank you. I feel like I'm real fertile soil, taking in everything that's been happening today and your words and your wisdom. So blessings to your family, your past, your present, and your future. I thank you. In my neighborhood in Brooklyn, I was raised in a black neighborhood. I'm part African American, Native American, Latinx, and East Indian. And everybody in my neighborhood was raised in a black neighborhood, Mike Tyson's neighborhood, so don't get in my way. But everybody grew. Everybody had plants and vegetables, and they traded recipes, and people walked down the hall in the projects, or if you had a house, people exchanged seeds, and it was just really natural. And I thought that everybody did this in every neighborhood. And then as I got older, I said, well, I'm going to get into, the natural foods. So I called up a few organic delivery companies in New York, and they wouldn't deliver to Brownsville, Brooklyn. And I really thought that was jacked up. So then I would make a big voice about it, don't get in my way. And they would deliver, but it would be jacked up vegetables. I mean, everything would be bruised and battered. And so I said, well, I gotta learn how to do this. And maybe my pinky is green, not my thumb, but I'm working on it. I'm not a farmer, but I am. I'm digging y'all. I'm a yoga teacher, I'm a musician, but I just wanted to stand and be a woman of color in the room among many women of color in the room and men, and thank us all for standing together strongly and getting the courage with my friends here to stand and speak, and to thank you so much, and thank all of us so much for hearing.
I had a thought about the land. We just went through on our farm a detailed thing to put it in a land trust. And it's the Finger Lakes Land Trust. And there were all sorts of things in this land trust that were limitations on what we could do with the land, which was the whole idea, and we thought a wonderful thing. You can't build a lot of houses on this land. You can't use it for any kind of other commercial. It has to be dedicated to farm. So there were all the things that we can't do. But what if we could influence these organizations to say what other things we should do or could do with the land? What if there were incentives? People are going for these land trusts like crazy because they believe the land should be kept in agricultural use. But what if we could influence those land trust organizations to say, well, here's something that you could do that is not only allowed, it's what we'd love to have you do, and that is have indigenous or some people farm part of that land as part of the agreement.
I just want to add something to that real quick. Thank you for saying that. And actually, Ramona Peters and the other Mashpee Wampanoag folks at the Native Land Conservancy in Massachusetts are doing just that. And so they are taking a tool that's used in California called the Cultural Respect Easement, which California is the only state that recognizes it. But this native-run land trust is trying to get other states, Maine is going to be next, then Massachusetts, then New York, to adopt and approve this kind of easement. And it's not a restrictive easement, it's a positive use easement. So it says this particular land shall forever and always, for all heirs and assign, give access to a particular native community for certain uses: ceremony, hunting, fishing, basket making, burial, and other cultural uses, so that there's cultural preservation. It's a brilliant tool, and keep your eye out, because I'm going to encourage every single landowner to put a cultural respect easement on their land so we can have true shared sovereignty with native folks, like my sister's saying here, so we can share, because there is enough for all of us. Right?
Hi, my name is Hugo from Montreal. One of the gentlemen, you mentioned you were looking for land, to own land in the future. I was wondering what town in upstate, in New York or in the Northeast you were from, yeah? Because there's a lot of farmers here. Maybe there's people here that are from the same town, right, or same place that yeah. Well, we.
Yeah.
Okay. Brooklyn, okay. New York Central. All right. Yeah, I one thing I was inspired by was the reparations in the Seattle, Northwest Pacific, where a bunch of white people got together and they wanted to do an anti-racist action. So they started calling for paying rent for indigenous people on indigenous land, and they created this kind of fund, and people would give $25 a month or $50 a month, and they started creating a system for paying rent. And there's been other folks in Arizona where a landowner just gave his land reach out to the native community around and give his land to the native community. So I was just curious of how do we go deeper in the conversation around reparations, and if other people here had any idea of what was happening in upstate New York or the northeastern area. Cheers.
Word. I can say a little bit about that. Thank you very much. So Ed Whitfield, who's a mentor of mine, a co-op developer, elder, former Black Panther, really wonderful public speaker, he gives this perfect metaphor for reparations in my mind. He said, imagine that your neighbor stole your cow and a couple weeks later knocked on your front door with tears in their eyes and apologies on their lips and remorse in their heart for stealing your cow. They knew that was not correct. But they said, let me make it up to you. Every week for the rest of this cow's life, I will bring you half a pound of butter to show how sorry I am. What would you say? Give me the cow. You took my cow, right? And so that's why we talk about, because so much of quote unquote racial justice work these days is sort of the metaphorical half a pound of butter. It's like, well, we'll have a little program here or there, but I'm not fundamentally giving away all this wealth, but really thinking about giving back. So that's a metaphor, but to answer your question directly, I think the work is in baby steps. I mentioned briefly the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust that we're creating. We've been encouraged by Indigenous elders to move at the pace of trust, which is hard for A-types like me, but we're building relationships with the Abenaki and the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag and the Schaghticoke and the Mohican. It takes time to build relationships. We've just elected a board. We've just hired co-coordinators. And the model of that land trust, which will cover all of New England and New York, is to be able to receive those donations and redistribute land back to Native community as well as Black, Latinx, Asian farmers. So that's one thing to kind of look out for. I don't know if folks have other examples locally in terms of the reparations work.
I am Alexis Mena, and I'm starting the first commercial Black-owned aquaponic farm in Brooklyn in 2 5,000 square feet buildings. I'm working with this company that was owned by a white man, and he had 2 buildings sitting there not doing anything for over 15 years. His daughter approached me because I'm an organizer and said, come use this as your artist studio. And I said, 10,000 square feet is way too big for any fucking artist studio. That's crazy. But this is like opportunity here, right? So what can we do here? And so with the lighting company, we're partnering with them to create agricultural lighting. We're teaching people how to become greenhouse technicians and how to build solar panels to break into the green tech industry and how to become, urban farmers. I have a GoFundMe up. Come see me afterwards. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Leah, for being here. My name is Morgan Hartman. I work for NOFA-New York as the Organic Dairy and Livestock Coordinator. In that capacity, I work with a lot of dairy farmers, and as you may know, in not just upstate New York, but across this country, dairy farmers of every stripe and color are suffering hugely. And it's not a position of us and them in terms of race or color, but in terms of control, financial control. And I believe in some ways, free markets are wonderful when they are truly free and not monopolized by corporate entities. Even some of our certified organic co-ops, which are monopolizing the situation. We're losing farmers in this country every day. Less than 2% of our total population in the United States is farming. We've got to come together. And I thank you, Leah, for what you are doing at Soulfire Farm, your whole team, your whole community, what you are doing. And really that's what NOFA-New York is about as well, and NOFA Mass, and MAFCA, and PCO. We're supposed to be working together, and we are, but we still find our fault lines, and we're suffering for it. Because there are those entities out there that will capitalize. I use the term purposely. They will capitalize upon these fault lines. Yep. So to the extent we can, reach out to our fellow farmers, whether they're Amish, African American, Latinx, indigenous, native peoples. We have to reach out and sit down at the table and eat together and grow food together and raise our kids together. You know you're in trouble when the milk check comes and in the envelope is a letter with a suicide prevention hotline phone number. That's where we are. Leah's message tonight is so broad. Thank you.
So I think we'll take like one more question, but I want to build on that. I really appreciate you talking about coming together across fault lines, so to speak. And I think that it's even beyond just farmers. You know, something that was recently explained to me, which makes so much sense, is one of the ways that the empire, you know, society tries to divide, for example, black folks and rural white folks, and why we have the person elected that we do, is as the dairy industry in upstate New York and other places is eroded, a major industry that's come to take its place is the private prisons, right? And so you have these rural economies that are dependent on jobs, like prison guards and so on, to survive. And then these rural politicians then are pushing for really harsh sentencing and rigid drug laws and so on and so forth, so we can round up folks from New York City from 7 zip codes and ship them upstate to keep the economy going. And so it's just one of those examples of something that seems on the surface like, oh, it's just about milk. There's all of this, I would say, intentional seeding of division and profiteering going on and all of that. And I think that if we get anti-mass incarceration folk, prison abolitionists at the table with dairy farmers, like what a conversation about how we can actually work together, right, in those movements. So thank you. All right, let's take one more question. Or not.
Question is not a question.
Yeah.
It's more of a comment. Just based on what you just said, and there was something that was witnessed earlier today, just in terms of one of the workshops, thinking about how we come together in this space. So I'm someone who, I don't know if it's okay to call you out, but someone like Leah who embodies in myself, white heritage as well as black folks' heritage. So I've had to figure out ways of being in my own body, in my own psyche, around how to overcome some of these traumas that we talk about here, right? And I think the reason I say that is because I think it's absolutely critical that as a community, we are a body here, right? That we need to figure out how to hold space for those parts of ourselves that have been wronged and experienced trauma. And that, this is my first NOFA, and I'm really grateful to be here. But I don't know the context for how NOFA does its work, but just thinking about a lot more intentionality around how do we hold space, how do white folks hold space when we invite folks of color to come in and present in front of us or what have you. Is there work that we can do inside of our organization, inside our body, right? This is our body here. What kind of work do we need to do to be able to hold space for those parts of ourselves that are really hurt and experiencing trauma? So I'm just bringing that up because I was triggered earlier today, and just in some of these conversations, I'm just realizing that I hope that there's some more consciousness that's brought to how do, as a predominantly white community historically, what I can see from NOFA has been a white community. What do we need to do as to make our body whole, and really allow this diversity to come in here?
So I'm really into poems and quotes, so we're just going to close out with Khalil Gibran, because it is all about love, even when love is challenging and painful in its growth. You probably know this one. And what is it to work with love? It is to weave the cloth with threads drawn from your hearts, even as if your beloved were to wear that cloth. It is to build a house with affection, even as if your beloved were to dwell in that house. It is to sow seeds with tenderness and reap the harvest with joy, even as if your beloved were to eat the fruit. It is to charge all things you fashion with a breath of your own spirits, and to know that all the blessed dead are standing about you and watching. Often have I heard you say, as if speaking in sleep, he who works in marble and finds the shape of his own soul in the stone is nobler than he who plows the soil. And he who seizes the rainbow to lay it on a cloth in the likeness of man is more than he who makes the sandals for our feet. But I say, not in sleep, but in the over-wakefulness of noontide, that the wind speaks not more sweetly to the giant oaks than to the least of all the blades of grass. And she alone is great who turns the voice of the wind into a song made sweeter by her own loving. Work is love made visible. And if you cannot work with love but only with distaste, it is better that you should leave your work and sit at the gate of the temple and take alms of those who work with joy. For if you bake bread with indifference, you bake a bitter bread that feeds but half a person's hunger. And if you grudge the crushing of the grapes, your grudge distills a poison in the wine. And if you sing, though as angels, and love not the singing, you muffle a person's ears to the voices of the day and the voices of the night. Thank you.